The United States has launched military interventions in the vast majority of countries on Earth. Many people know that, but they can't really visualize it. So I went through the US government's own data published by the US Congress that documented all of the US military interventions going back to 1798, and I created a map. This map shows the US military interventions abroad that have been acknowledged officially by the Congressional Research Service. You can see that it includes almost every single country in Latin America and the Caribbean. It also includes most of the African continent and huge parts of Asia, as well as Europe, of course. Now, I want to stress this point. These are only military interventions. So this does not include the hundreds and perhaps thousands of other forms of meddling that the US has engaged in pretty much every country on Earth, including organizing coups, meddling in elections, stealing elections, spreading propaganda, fake news, funding opposition groups. I mean, there's so many examples of US meddling in pretty much every country. These are just the military interventions that have been admitted by the US government. And since 1991, we are talking about 251 US military interventions abroad. This data comes from a report that was published by the US Congress's investigation arm, which is called the Congressional Research Service. And on March 8th of 2022, it published a report titled Instances of Use of United States Armed Forces Abroad, 1798 to 2022. So between those years, from 1798 until today, it documented 469 US military interventions. And I need to stress this point again. Half of those, more than half of those, were after 1991. The United States launched at least 251 military interventions abroad between 1991 and 2022, and then 218 military interventions abroad between 1798 and 1990. Why is that important? Because it shows that after the end of the First Cold War, when the United States claimed that it was, going to support peace and democracy and freedom and all that nonsense after the Soviet Union was overthrown, the US continued and actually accelerated its foreign military interventions. Now, I also want to stress that this data from the Congressional Research Service, all of these figures are actually conservative because they don't include domestic deployments. They don't include the Civil War in the United States. They don't include the war between the US settlers and the British Empire that established the United States. They don't include the domestic deployment of soldiers to carry out genocide and ethnic cleansing against the indigenous population. They also don't include US special operations. The US military has special operations forces operating across the planet. Of course, we don't exactly know what they're doing because these are covert operations. So all of this data that was acknowledged, they are foreign military interventions that have been publicly acknowledged and admitted by the US government. Now, there is another data set that's even larger from an organization called the Military Intervention Project. This is at Tufts University, its Center for Strategic Studies. And it found that the US has taken more than 500 international military interventions since 1776. And 60% of those foreign military interventions were between 1950 and 2017. So that is since the beginning of the First Cold War. More than 1/3 of those foreign military interventions were after 1999. And the Military Intervention Project points out that, quote, with the end of the Cold War era, that's the First Cold War, we're now in the Second Cold War, but with the end of the First Cold War, we would expect the US to decrease its military operations abroad, assuming lower threats and interests at stake. But these patterns reveal the opposite. The US has increased its military involvements abroad.